Hi everybody and welcome to Murder at Bedtime with me, Lyndon. If you are a regular listener, you know I think you are all awesome, and if this is your first time, I hope I can persuade you to return. This is a 10 to 20 minute true crime bedtime story. No frills, no waffle, no ads, no sponsors. You don't even have to buy me a coffee. It's just me and a mic and a story, and you hopefully listening. And with that, let's crack on with this week's story, The Blackpool Poisoner. 79-year-old Sarah Ann Ricketts was a cantankerous, unlikable woman. She had managed to have two husbands, but had seen both of them off. Strangely, the pair of them gassing themselves in the same oven of the same bungalow at 339 Devonshire Road, Blackpool. Weird. She also managed to become estranged from her two daughters, who had very little to do with her, and any housekeepers cum companions she employed tended to not stay in the job long. The latest of these being the wife and husband team of 47-year-old Mrs. Louisa May Merrifield and her much older husband, 71-year-old Alfred Edward. And she had employed the pair, who relocated from Wigan to Blackpool to be live-in housekeeper handyman companions to the old lady. What she didn't realise was that this dodgy pair had been zigzagging across Lancashire, ripping up old ladies for years, staying a while, pilfering what they could, then moving on. It is thought Louisa had 20 different jobs between 1950 and 1953 when they rolled up at Devonshire Road, Blackpool. It wasn't long before Sarah Ann was complaining that she wasn't getting enough to eat, and the couple, instead of looking after her, was spending all their time and their money getting drunk in Blackpool's numerous hostelries. Now, normally this would have resulted in past housekeepers being given their marching orders, but Mrs. Merrifield was very cunning. Knowing how Sarah had a knack of upsetting everybody, she came across, whether it be friend or family, usually by changing her will frequently. You could be written into it one week for doing what you were told, and written out of it the following week for something very trivial. Mrs. Merrifield took her employer's side in everything, probably gradually earning her trust and talking herself into the said famous will, but also knowing she could be removed from it at a moment's notice. It was time to act fast, strike while the iron's hot, so to speak. So before we go any further, who was Louisa May Merrifield? Well, she was born in Wigan, Lancashire in 1906 to Job Highway, a coal mine labourer, and Emma Highway. Now, there isn't really much history on Louisa until 1931, when she was 25, when she married 24-year-old Joseph Allison. At this time, she had a very respected job as a Salvation Army captain. This was thought of as a very happy marriage, and they had 6 children together, even though 2 of the youngest children, Horace and Ernest, died after just a year. In 1946, Louisa was in serious trouble for the first time for ration book fraud. Even though the Second World War ended in 1945, rationing continued right into the 1950s in Britain. And because she was caught using her dead father's ration book, which I believe entitled her to an extra 5 grams of cheese, and also she refused to pay the £10 fine. For this she was given 84 days in prison. Seems a bit severe to me. And unfortunately, her children were taken into care. Louisa was released from prison in November 1946 and went back to her husband, but I can't find any information that she ever had her children returned to her. 3 years later, she lost her husband Joseph. It doesn't seem to have been suspicious because his death was recorded as subacute infective hepatitis. But she wasn't to be single for long, because within 5 months she had married 78-year-old Richard Weston. Now, he only lasted 10 weeks before dying of a heart attack. Let's hope he died with a smile on his face. But once again, Louisa didn't hang about, and 7 months later she was tying the knot with 68-year-old Alfred Edward Merriweather, only a whippersnapper by Louisa's standards, a mere 24 years older than her. It was a match made in heaven, as they were both lazy, liars, thieves, and loved to get blinding drunk. Alfred himself had deserted a wife and 10 children, as it got in the way of his drinking. And so it came to pass, after replying to a newspaper ad, they duly uprooted from Wigan to Blackpool and the home of Sarah Ann Ricketts. I just wonder, did no one ask for references in those days? So back to the main story. So even though Sarah Ann believed the pair were starving her, which is slightly weird, as from the reports I've read, she lived on a diet of jam, straight from the jar with a spoon, couldn't get enough of the sticky stuff, and rum or a bottle of beer. But somehow Louisa managed to wheedle her way into Sarah Ann's will. Firstly, as a sole benefactor, but when husband Alfred got wind of it, he was not well pleased, and managed to persuade the old lady to change it once again, this time to the couple being co-benefactors. As you can imagine, this infuriated Louisa, who I think had tired of Alfred and was going to dump him once she got her hands on the dosh. I also think, not as daft as he made out, Alfred realised this too. Louisa, probably knowing she wouldn't be able to make her employer budge, decided to make the most of a bad job, before Sarah Ann cut them out altogether. Now, let's be honest, Louisa wasn't a criminal mastermind by a long way. She actually went into town and bought Rhodine rat poison from the local chemist and signed the poison register. Now, Rhodine, I am reliably informed, is still available off the shelf in stores today, even though it no longer contains large amounts of white phosphorus, which causes severe or fatal liver damage and organ failure if ingested. Apparently, it has the scent of garlic and makes a corpse glow in the dark. On April the 9th, 1953, Louisa summoned Sarah Ann's doctor, a Dr. Yule, on the pretence that the old lady was very unwell and could have a stroke at any minute. Dr. Yule, after seeing his patient, was annoyed at Louisa for wasting his time, as Sarah Ann, apart from a touch of bronchitis, was fine. It became clear the doctor had been called just to prove that Sarah Ann was compos mentis in case the new will was challenged. On April the 13th, Dr. Yule was called again to attend the bungalow on Devonshire Road because, according to Louisa, Sarah Ann was once again seriously ill. Dr. Yule was unavailable, so his partner, Dr. Wood, made the house call and gave Louisa a bit of a tongue lashing for wasting his time, telling her that her employer was only suffering from mild bronchitis and was much the same as when he examined her 3 years before. It is presumably after this visit that Louisa Merrifield started serving jars of jam laced with huge doses of Rhodine by the spoonful to Sarah Ann. Now, how Louisa would know that blackcurrant jam and rum would be found later in tests to be the best things to mask the horrible taste of Rhodine is anybody's guess. The next day, sometime in the evening, Sarah Ann died. But this time Louisa didn't call the doctor. She waited until the next day, saying that she hadn't wanted to bother him by bringing him out late at night to an obviously dead woman. The only problem was that 2 days before Sarah Ann's death, Louisa met up with a friend called Jessie Brewer at the pub, where she told Mrs. Brewer, "I have to return to lay out an old lady." When Mrs. Brewer asked who died, Louisa replied, "She's not dead yet, but she soon will be." When Jessie Brewer saw the death of Sarah Ann reported in the local paper, she went to the police and the Merrifields became prime suspects. After a search of the house, no Rodine was found on the premises, but a check of local pharmacists found that Louisa had bought and signed the poisons register in a local chemist's. Now, to be honest, apart from a spoon in an old handbag, which may have had residue of phosphorus on it, and the way she tried to get the local funeral director, George Henry Jackson, to cremate the body as soon as possible without alerting Sarah Ann's daughters, even though both the doctors had refused to issue a death certificate because the death was suspicious, the evidence is still pretty much circumstantial. But anyway, due to Jessie Brewer's statement and the buying of the Rodine, the Merrifields were arrested. The trial took place at Manchester Assizes between the 20th and 31st of July 1953 before Judge Justice Glyn Jones, and Louisa, right from the start, did not make a good impression. She played up to the crowd, laughing and smiling and waving to her friends. She was boastful and a bare-faced liar, and at one stage accused her husband and Sarah Ann of being in a sexual relationship. Alfred, on the other hand, had appeared confused by the whole proceedings and had been described as dim-witted and even a simpleton by the judge. But was he? The judge, in his summing up, described Louisa as being vulgar and stupid, but that didn't mean that she was a murderer. In the end, it took 13 hours for the jury to come to agreement that she was guilty of murder. But not so Alfred, who they could not agree on. So as his wife was being sentenced to death, Alfred was going home to his, now for the moment anyway, sole occupancy of the bungalow on Devonshire Road until it was decided a date for his new trial. There was to be no reprieve from the Home Secretary for Louisa, and at just after 9 a.m. on Friday, September the 18th, she was hanged by Albert Pierpoint at Strangeways Prison. So what about deaf, confused, dim-witted, simpleton Alfred? Well, they decided not to retry him. He went on to get a share of Sarah Ann's will, with which he bought a caravan. He could be found on Blackpool's famous Golden Mile, where he had a booth at the fair, where he advertised himself as the husband of the murderess and told stories of his life with Louisa. He also sold some of her clothes to local waxwork museum Louis Tussauds and was paid £200 to have an effigy of himself placed next to his wife in their Chamber of Horrors exhibition. So was Alfred dim-witted or very, very cunning? Well, I hope you found that story interesting. And if you did, please leave it a review if it's on the podcast. And, please give it a thumbs up and maybe subscribe to the channel and ding the little bell for future notifications. Well, I haven't got any waffle this week. Nothing has happened to me much at all. So I'm going to save you from me this week. And all I'm going to say is thank you for listening and see you next time and sleep well. Night-night.